Okay, we're going to take a little bit of a detour and think about some other data series that people might care about. And so this one's about income mobility. So this is the extent um, that people move up the income ladder. So essentially, do you make more money than your parents did? All right. And so this one has been much in the news. This is work by Raj Chetty and his co-authors. Um, and their group is called Opportunity Insights. You can go to their website and kind of check it out. And so this is where they find really stark differences where, if you go back to 1940, like over 90% made more than their parents at age 30. And this number has dropped to about 50% by present day birth cohorts. Okay. And so this is one where it's like, well, this is the quote unquote the American dream is dead because only half the people make more than their parents now, whereas before 90% made more than their parents. Okay. Um, this is like you can kind of look at what it looks like. And so this is say if you are in the this is the household income rank. So if your parents are if your parents are making in the top, you're in the top 20%. This is like I think this is back in like 2015 data, I think. So it's like if you're above 105K per household, you're in the top 20%, which is like I think that's lower than most people think. Like, my friends who I went to UCLA with. Yeah, I'm old now. I'm 40, um, and so my friends who I went to UCLA, they're all like doctors and engineers and stand-up comics and whatever else they do. Um, but whenever we talk, I always point out, hey, you're in the top 20%. If your household is making over 105K, I think in the present it's like 150, I think I said. I don't know what it is. I think it's 150, 160, whatever it is. They're like, no, we're not. We're not rich. And it's like, yeah, by any definition, you're in the top 20%. Um, but anyways, and so this is like looking at, all right, so say you're in the top 20%, where are your children likely to end up? So let's just follow this up in the 60th percentile. So essentially what you have is typical mean reversion. So people at the top say that their children end up in the 70th percentile. People at the bottom, the 20th percentile, their children end up in the 40th percentile. So you kind of have this compression on average. Of course, there are exceptions to this. This is just the average. This is kind of what the average distribution look like. If you sort of had like perfect equality of outcomes where it didn't matter where you were born, this would be like right at the 50% line. Everyone would kind of end up on average in the middle. All right. So, but we do have some compression. So if you're at the top, you're likely to move down. If you're in the bottom, you're likely to move up. So this is just kind of what it looks like in the snapshot of the present. Okay. All right. And the extent of this mobility. So mobility, essentially what we care about, usually what we care about is this bottom 50%. To what extent, what are your chances of making it, upward? And so on general, on average, most people do make more than their parents when they start in the bottom here on average. If you just like look at this, you start at the 40th percentile, they make, they're a little higher. Okay. Now, this really varies by place though. Okay. So what this is the average household income for children whose parents were in the 25th percentile. So if your parents were kind of in that bottom of the distribution, um, in a certain point in time. So this is all taking snapshots. One of the difficulties is people move all over the income distribution over their lifetime, and so you may be in the bottom 25th percentile one year, and then in the top 25th percentile the other year, which may seem crazy, but that happens all the time. And you think of somebody in grad school or in medical school, they're in the bottom 20th percentile. When they come out, they move up. Okay. But anyway, so what this is looking at is okay, how much do these kids who come from that bottom 25th percentile or come actually from the 20th percentile, where do they end up? Adjusting for inflation, their parents are making 27,000. Where do they end up? And what you can see is there's some places where on average they're actually doing worse than their parents. So, if we look at this would be like right around here. If we come up here, well, it looks like they move up on average to the 40th percentile. This is at the national level. Your parents were in the 25th percentile, should be right there. You're on average going to end up in the 40th percentile. So you move up a little bit. Okay. This really varies by place though. And so you can see kind of these zones in the South, the deep South, it's unlikely to happen. Up here in the Rust Belt, also unlikely to happen. Up here in the upper Midwest, you're very likely to move up. And this also varies. So this varies within the nation, and this varies, within cities. So here you have LA, and so you can see there's like essentially areas where people are very much likely to move up. Monterey Park, in particular, down here in Lakewood, over here near the beach. People whose parents were in that 20th percentile in these areas, they essentially are much more likely to move up than kind of here. They this would be like Compton. This is like South LA, basically, which are much, much less likely to move up. And so this is just interesting to think about, this income mobility, because typically this is like kind of what we care about. Is it possible to move up? If you think about, most people, when they kind of start the discussion about inequality, they talk about this philosopher John Rawls, and they say, okay, he has this thought experiment where, would you, if you the way you want to kind of structure a society is like, it doesn't matter where you're born. It doesn't matter where or who you're born to. You want to live in a society where, if it's just random chance, you'd be okay with that. Okay. And what you can see is like, you probably, that would not be true. You don't really want to be born down here to this low income, or in LA, your chances of moving up are much lower, depending on where you're born. But let's look at some critiques and caveats of this work. Okay. And with this, I'm talking specifically about this graph, where it's like, wow, you're much less likely to move up in the present than in the past. Okay. This is an absolute earnings. Okay. And then this is just a side. This is kind of a tangent within a tangent, just because it's super interesting and kind of cutting edge work. All right. So let's look at critiques of that moving up. So remember, we're comparing 1940 to 1980. All right. So one of the issues is family size changes. So, if your family is much smaller, this is household income again. If your family is much smaller, your dollars go further. So, in the present, even though you may make less, you actually may have more take-home income or more expendable or disposable income because you have less children. Also, 1940 was a incredibly depressed year. Right? This is the end of the Great Depression. Incomes were really, really down. Another thing is dual earners. Household consumptions, or essentially households have changed. And so how do we account for the dual earners? There are other issues about taxes and transfers. So taxes are much higher in the present, in average tax rate. And the transfers are also much higher. So the social safety net is much more generous than it was in 1940. And then we have the similar issue with, how do we treat inflation? How do we deal with dollars today versus dollars in the past? This is fundamentally a hard problem, because the things you can buy in the present are much different than the things you can buy in the past. So it's not just, it's hard to adjust dollar amounts. We do it, we have a method of doing it, but you can buy an iPhone in the present. You couldn't buy an iPhone in 1940. So how do we think about that? You can go on YouTube and essentially learn any skill you want to learn via tutorials in the present. You couldn't do that in the past. So how do we treat that? This is a very difficult question. Another issue with the Chetty work, with this graph in particular, and actually this graph, is we are looking at income. This is income at age 30. This one is income between 31 and 37. That's a very young age to look at it. Okay. Many people are in grad school that age. I was in grad school when I was 30. I was making like, whatever you make in grad school, like 15,000 a year or something. And so, you're in grad school, and the average grad student is 33. So many of your kind of like later high income people are actually, in grad school, not making anything. Okay. Like, I know certainly in this graph, I was born in 1980, there's no way I made as much as my dad did in 1980. So when he was, my dad was 30, he was engineer for JPL. When I was 30, I was in grad school making nothing. So it's like, it's not necessarily a fair comparison. No one would feel sorry for me, being in grad school. And many earnings growth come later in the career in their present. So many people, their earnings really go up in their late 30s and 40s. And so let me just take these issues kind of one by one. So what you can see is, this is what it looks like in 1940. So children were much more like, here's the children distribution of income from 1940. Here's the parents. So what we can see is like, well, it was very easy to out earn your parents in 1940 because your parents weren't making anything. This is an incredibly depressed time. And so, yeah, of course, 90% of the children did better. Nobody was making anything. As if you adjust for family size, this is from the Chetty's own paper. You can see again, so the blue line is the one that we showed you. That's at the household level. This is if you just look at fathers and sons. So if you adjust for kind of the household composition, you see a much still decline. You're less like, you're only 60% chance of out earning your parents, but it's not as stark as the graph we showed previously. And this is again if you use different price deflators, different ways of treating inflation. Again, doesn't look as bad. And then if you include taxes and transfers, okay, doesn't look as stark. Okay. This is from other data, kind of looking at this is the data I was able to find in terms of income growth. And so what you can see is there are very different income growth by age groups. So basically what we're doing is we're fixing everybody here in 1967. And we're seeing, okay, how did the groups in these different age brackets, how did their household income change from the 60s to the present? And so what you can see is there's this huge growth of the 65 and older and the 55 to 64 and kind of the next bracket. These are the groups where you see lots of growth. And so this is just saying in the present, it seems like a lot of earnings growth happened later in the career rather than earlier. So you don't have much here for the younger groups, but all of it's focused in these later groups. So again, this is just another critique of Chetty. So I do think mobility has gone down though. So I'm not disputing kind of the fundamental finding that, you're less likely to out earn your parents. But to the extent that it's gone down, I don't know if it's as stark once you include these caveats. So there are others work looking at mobility. This is again from Splinter, Auden and Splinter, kind of looking at different data sets. And so in the PSID, you can see in general that bottom quintile does out earn their parents. Okay, there's an increase in income, 100% increase in income. Second quintile, middle quintile, fourth quintile. Okay, in absolute terms, it looks like there is some movement using that PSID data. Okay, another way to look at it, it's another way a Splinter does it, is by saying let's compare the cross section to the panel. All right, what does this mean? So this is just saying like, okay, let's look at how much more people in the highest quintile, the highest 25%, highest 20%, are making in 2014 compared to 1980. And we see this huge expansion, and it doesn't look like there's much growth. All right, and this is kind of the top line. This is like the top line results from like Piketty and Saez, where it's like, whoa, look at this expansion up here. They're making so much more. Everyone else isn't making that much more. That's if you look at the cross section, basically taking somebody in the top 20% in 1980, comparing somebody in the top 20% in 2014. What Splinter says, that's kind of the wrong way to think about it, because the people in those groups change over time. So the people in the top 20%, it's not like if I'm in the top 20% in 1980, I'm also in the top 20% in 2014. That changes. I move down, I retire, I move down in the income distribution. And someone else who was in the bottom, say this person in grad school, they move up in the income distribution. So what he says, let's look at panel approach. Let's follow people over time and see how much their income grows. And so if you basically start with somebody in the lowest quintile, the lowest 20% in 1980, follow them over time, their income grows. They move basically up in the distribution, same here, same here, same here. And then people in the top 20% in 1980 actually move down. So when you see all these figures, it's basically, when you go back here to inequality figures, it's basically kind of treating, the way people think about this is the same top 1%. They think they're the same people, but it's not the same people. It's people are moving out of that top 1%. People are moving into the top 1%. So this is actually like a different group of people over time. And this is what he's trying to capture. Splinter is trying to capture down here by saying like, okay, if I just hold the group of people constant, what does their income look like over time? And he sees growth in the bottom and kind of falling in the top, which is kind of what you see here if you just look at the Chetty figures too, which is not necessarily the same people, but comparing parents and children, where, if you start up here really high, this is the top 1%, your children are not likely to, on average, they're going to be in like the 70 percentile. They're still doing great, but they're not, not going to stay in the 1% on average. Of course, there are exceptions. And we tend to focus on the exceptions. So we tend to focus on, Sam Walton made all this money from Walmart. We look at his kids, they're still, super rich. Right. That's kind of like, there are like a select few rich people. As I mentioned, most of these are just like, up here, it's mostly just like, tech workers and doctors and engineers. Okay. And some professors are up here, not me, but some professors are way up here. Okay. And so again, kind of the punchline for all these, throwing a lot of figures at you. And maybe it's really confusing, but kind of that's the point. I mean, the point is like, this is a very complicated way to think about it. These are complicated questions. Like, how do we treat changes over time? Like, you can't just take a cross section. It's like there are different people moving up and down. Households are changing. You have dual earner households or tri-earner households. How do we treat that? People are having less kids. Okay, does that matter to people? Because then you don't have as many people to support. People are living longer. There's more things you could buy with your money now. So it's like, is it really comparable? And so the whole point is like, it's not trivial. It's not trivial to just look at a cross section and say, whoa, things have changed a lot. Things have changed, but the details are, there's lots of details. It's just, it's just a difficult question. It's not as easy as just, flashing this graph and saying, oh, the American dream is dead. Like, it's much more complex than that. All right, another break.